Dakota Territory, August 1883. The sun was a hammer, beating the parched earth into a cracked mosaic. Most men were in the fields, racing the coming autumn, their movements sharp and efficient under the oppressive heat. All except one. Jakob Steiner was on his knees inside his newly raised cabin, not laying a floor, but mixing mud. His hands, caked to the elbow, worked a slurry of yellow clay, river sand, and straw. He moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm that seemed out of place with the frantic energy of the season. From the doorway, his neighbors watched. They saw a man building what looked like a bizarre, misshapen altar in the very heart of his home. It was a monstrous block of earth taking up valuable space where a table or a cradle should go. They saw him embedding field stones into the mixture, then carving strange, winding channels into its surface before adding another layer. They muttered to each other at the trading post, their words laced with a mixture of pity and contempt. He was a quiet man, this German immigrant, with a wife, Anna, and a young son, Emil. He kept to himself, which was suspicious enough on the frontier. But this was madness. He was building a chimney from mud. Not just a chimney, but a solid, room-stealing heap of it. They called it Steiner's Mud Heap. The name stuck. It was a joke whispered over fence posts and across the general store counter. What did this quiet man, this outsider with calloused hands and a strange accent, understand about the killing cold of a Dakota winter? What did he know that every experienced carpenter and homesteader who put their faith in cast iron and straight flues had missed? The answer would be paid for in firewood and frostbite, and it would change how everyone in that valley survived. If you want to see more stories of forgotten wisdom that turned the tables on conventional thinking, hit that subscribe button right now. Your support keeps these histories alive. To understand Jakob Steiner's obsession with mud, you first have to understand the terror of the previous winter. The winter of 1882 had been a wolf at the door. Not a metaphorical wolf, but a real and tangible predator made of air and ice. It was a season that scoured the land and tested the soul of every living thing. The settlers of Red Creek Bend thought they were prepared. They had built their cabins tight, chinking the logs with moss and mud. They had stacked cords of oak and cottonwood until the piles reached the eaves of their homes. And in the center of each cabin stood the symbol of modern frontier survival, the cast iron stove. It was a marvelous invention. It consumed wood with ferocious appetite, and in return it radiated a circle of blistering heat. You could stand 2 feet from it and feel your skin prickle, your wool shirt turning uncomfortably hot. But 3 feet away, the heat vanished. It was a mirage. The cold was a physical presence. It seeped through the thickest logs. It crept under doors and through the smallest cracks in the window frames. A rime of frost grew on the heads of nails inside the cabins, sparkling in the lantern light like cruel diamonds. Water left in a bucket overnight would be a solid block by morning. Ink froze in its wells, and men's beards would crystallize with their own breath the moment they stepped outside. The iron stove fought a losing battle. It burned and burned, its little door glowing a dull cherry red. The heat it produced rose directly to the ceiling and was immediately lost. The stovepipe, exiting straight through the roof, was a chimney for warmth as much as it was for smoke. Settlers could watch the precious heat shimmer and vanish into the unforgiving sky. The real measure of the stove's failure was the woodpile. A stack that looked like it would last until May was half gone by January. The sound of axes ringing in the frozen air became a constant, desperate drumbeat. Men ventured farther and farther into the woods, risking frostbite and exhaustion to feed the insatiable iron beast in their homes. Families huddled together in a single room, closing off the rest of the cabin, living in a cramped circle of warmth while the rest of their home was as cold as a tomb. They were prisoners of the stove. Jakob Steiner had endured that winter with his family, just like everyone else. He had chopped the wood. He had watched the frost creep across his walls, but he watched with a different kind of eye. He was the son of a stonemason from the Austrian Alps, a man who had grown up in a world where stone and heat were understood not as enemies, but as partners. He remembered the great ketchelofen of his village, the massive ceramic and stone heaters that dominated the main room of every farmhouse. They were fed only once or twice a day with a small hot fire. Yet they radiated a gentle, pervasive warmth for 24 hours. They didn't just heat the air. They heated the very substance of the house. The heat was a member of the family, a constant, comforting presence. He looked at the American iron stove and saw not a solution, but a flaw. It was an engine designed for speed, not endurance. It released its energy all at once in a brilliant, wasteful flash. It was a sprinter in a marathon race against the cold. Jakob knew that to survive the winter, you did not need a sprint of fire. You needed a slow, steady pulse of warmth. And that pulse had to be stored somewhere. That was the knowledge he carried inside him. The memory of a different kind of fire, a different relationship with heat. While his neighbors saw him playing in the mud, he was not building a primitive chimney. He was building an engine. A slow, massive earthen engine designed to capture and tame fire itself. The construction began in the center of the cabin. First, a deep, insulated foundation of packed gravel and flat river stones, ensuring the ground beneath would not steal his precious heat. Upon this, he built the firebox, not from iron, but from the hardest, densest stones he could find, mortared with a special mixture of clay and sand. It was low and wide, designed for a horizontal burn, not the vertical blaze of an American fireplace. This was the first thing that drew the attention of Elias Vance. Vance was the closest thing Red Creek Bend had to an authority on building. He was a carpenter from Ohio, a man who had raised more than half the structures in the valley. His cabins were known for their tight joints and straight lines. He was a respected man, and his opinion carried the weight of hammered steel. He stopped by one afternoon, his arms crossed over his chest, a look of profound confusion on his face. He watched Jakob carefully laying a course of stones. "Steiner," he began, his voice not unkind, "that firebox has no grate, and it's far too shallow. Your fire will choke on its own ash." Jakob looked up, wiped a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of a muddy wrist, and replied in his careful, accented English, "The fire must be on the floor. It must burn completely." He offered no further explanation. Vance shook his head and left, telling his wife that night that the poor German was building his own coffin. The next stage of the build was what truly cemented Jakob's reputation as a fool. Once the firebox was complete, he did not build a chimney that went straight up. Instead, he began constructing a labyrinth. He built a series of channels that snaked back and forth, horizontally, rising slowly through the growing mass of mud, straw, and stone. The smoke, he understood, was not waste. It was a vehicle for heat. In a conventional chimney, that vehicle was allowed to race out of the house at top speed, carrying most of its valuable cargo with it. Jakob was building a long, winding road with speed bumps. He was forcing the hot gases to take the scenic route, a journey that would last many minutes instead of a few seconds. As the structure grew, it became a solid block nearly 5 feet wide and 4 feet deep, reaching almost to the ceiling. It was a hulking, earthen beast in the middle of the small cabin. He finished it with a smooth, thick plaster of fine clay, polishing it with a wet stone until it had a strange, organic sheen. Only at the very top did a small, conventional stovepipe emerge, passing through the roof. It was during this phase that Elias Vance returned. This time he brought 2 other settlers with him. He was genuinely concerned. He pointed a finger at the serpentine flue channels Jakob was plastering over. "Jacob, listen to me," Vance said, his voice firm with authority. "Smoke and heat rise. That's a law of God and nature. You are forcing them to travel sideways and even downwards in places. That flue will fill with soot and creosote inside a week." He tapped the mud wall. "And when that creosote catches fire, it won't be a chimney fire on your roof. It will be a furnace fire inside your house. This entire thing will either explode or bake your family alive." His logic was impeccable. It was based on a lifetime of experience with conventional fireplaces and stoves. A cold, slow-moving smoke was a dangerous smoke, thick with flammable deposits. Every man on the frontier knew that. Jakob Steiner simply nodded, his hands never ceasing their work. "The smoke will not be cold," he said quietly. "Not until the end." The men left, shaking their heads. The story of Vance's warning spread through the settlement like wildfire. The mockery intensified. Steiner's mud heap was now also Steiner's clay bomb. Wives warned their children not to play near the Germans' cabin. The family became isolated, islands in a sea of communal disapproval. Anna Steiner held her head high, but Jakob saw the hurt in her eyes. He simply told her, "Wait for the winter. It will keep you warm." As autumn deepened, Jakob cured his creation. He lit small, tentative fires, just a handful of kindling at a time, for several weeks. The massive structure steamed and sighed, the clay giving up its moisture, hardening into a monolithic block of ceramic. His neighbors saw the weak puffs of smoke from his chimney and laughed. He was burning a whole fire just to get a wisp of smoke, while their stoves could be roaring in minutes. They did not understand the system. They couldn't see the physics at play. Jakob had not built a fireplace. He had built a thermal battery. The principle was elegantly simple. He would burn a small amount of wood very, very hot and fast in the insulated firebox. The high temperature would ensure complete combustion, turning almost all of the wood into heat and gas, with very little smoke or creosote. These superheated gases would then be forced on their long journey through the winding channels of the mud heap. As the gases traveled, the immense mass of stone and clay, the thermal battery, would absorb the heat. The smoke would slow, cool, and surrender its energy to the structure. By the time the gases finally reached the small pipe at the top and exited the cabin, they would be so cool that you could almost hold your hand over the chimney pot. All the useful energy had been stripped out and stored in the hundreds of pounds of earth sitting in his living room. After the fire was out, the battery would begin to discharge. For the next 12, 16, even 24 hours, the mud heap would radiate a gentle, steady warmth into the cabin. It was not the scorching, temporary heat of an iron stove. It was a persistent, room-filling warmth that heated the objects, the walls, and the people, not just the air. It was a lung of stone, breathing heat into the home long after the fire had died. This was the secret Jakob Steiner held in his hands as he mixed his mud. A secret born in the cold mountains of a distant continent. Then December came. It arrived not with a gentle dusting of snow, but with a clenched fist of Arctic air that swept down from the north. The settlers called it the blue cold, a time when the sky was a painfully bright, clear blue, and the air was so frigid it felt like it could crack glass. The temperature at dawn on the first day of the snap was 10 degrees below zero. By sunset, the mercury in the trading post thermometer had withdrawn to 24 below. And then the wind began. It was a relentless, scouring wind that found every crack, every seam, every pinhole in the settlers' defenses. It drove the cold into the very bones of the cabins. The community's struggle began immediately. The familiar roar of the iron stoves became the soundtrack of every home. But this cold was different. It was a deep, pervasive cold that the stoves could not beat back. The heat they produced was ripped away by drafts and lost through the ceilings as fast as it was generated. Within 2 days, the wood piles began to shrink at a terrifying rate. A cord of wood that should last a month was being consumed in a week. The cheerful ringing of axes was replaced by a frantic hacking sound. Wood that wasn't fully seasoned was being thrown into the stoves, burning poorly and producing thick, dangerous smoke. Inside the cabins, life ground to a halt. Families abandoned all but one room, hanging blankets over doorways to create a small, defensible space. They lived in a constant twilight, huddled near the stove, wrapped in every layer they owned. Children were kept in their beds, buried under quilts and buffalo robes. The simple act of cooking a meal became a major undertaking, requiring a roaring fire that consumed a shocking amount of fuel. The cold was winning. Elias Vance was suffering along with everyone else, but for him, it was a special kind of torment. He was the master builder. His own cabin was his masterpiece. With logs perfectly scribed and fitted, he had built it to be a fortress against the winter. Now, that fortress had been breached. He stood in his main room, watching his wife, Sarah, add another log to their stove. The stove was glowing, devouring their precious hardwood. Yet 10 feet away, a mug of water on the table had a thin film of ice on it. He could feel a steady, knife-like draft coming from the north wall, a wall he had chinked himself, with pride. His expertise felt like a mockery. He was burning 4 times the amount of wood he normally would, and the cabin was still dangerously cold. His children were bundled so tightly they could barely move. The joy of the season was gone, replaced by a grim, anxious waiting for the cold to break and praying the woodpile would last. On the 3rd night of the cold snap, the temperature bottomed out at 35 degrees below zero, not accounting for the wind. The wind howled, piling snow into monstrous drifts that buried fences and blocked doors. It was a night when the land itself seemed to be dying. It was then that a thought, cold and sharp as an icicle, pierced Elias Vance's anxiety. Jakob Steiner, the German with the mud heap. What was happening in that cabin? He imagined the worst, a family frozen, overcome by a failed experiment, or worse, a fire, a catastrophic failure of the clay bomb, with no one able to get to them in the storm. A grim sense of duty settled over him. He had warned the man. He had led the chorus of mockers. If the Steiners were dead, it was their own foolishness, but he felt a sliver of responsibility. He had to know. He had to check. Before he even knew what he was doing, he was pulling on his heaviest coat and wrapping a scarf over his face. The vindication of an idea is often preceded by a moment of profound doubt, not just for the skeptics, but for the innovator as well. Stay with me, because what Elias Vance finds at the end of his journey is more than just a warm cabin. It's a lesson that humbled an entire community. And if you're finding value in this story, take a moment to hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that forgotten history matters. The journey to the Steiner cabin was a battle against a living enemy. The wind tore at Vance's clothes, trying to steal the thin layer of warmth he carried with him. The snow was waist-deep in places, a thick, powdery trap that made every step a monumental effort. The air he breathed in through his scarf was so cold, it burned his lungs. His own cabin was only a few hundred yards away, but it felt like miles. He navigated by the dark shapes of trees, specters against the blowing snow. The world had been reduced to a swirl of white and a howling, deafening roar. In his mind, he rehearsed what he would find. A dark, silent cabin, a grim discovery, a tragedy born of one man's stubborn pride. He felt a pang of guilt. Perhaps he should have tried harder to stop him, to persuade him. When he finally saw the faint, rectangular shape of the cabin through the storm, his heart sank. It was dark. There was no welcoming light in the window. And more ominously, there was absolutely no smoke coming from the chimney pipe. In this cold, a chimney not puffing smoke meant a dead fire. And a dead fire meant a dead family. He stumbled the last few feet to the door, his beard a solid mask of ice. He raised a gloved fist and hammered on the thick wood, his knock sounding feeble against the gale. He waited. Nothing. He knocked again, harder this time, shouting Steiner's name into the wind. He was about to put his shoulder to the door, convinced he was breaking into a tomb, when he heard the sound of the latch drawing back. The door swung inward. It was not a wave of cold that met him. It was a physical wall of warmth. A dense, enveloping, impossible warmth that flowed out of the cabin and wrapped around him. It was a heat so profound, so utterly at odds with the world outside, that for a moment Elias Vance felt dizzy. His mind could not reconcile the sensation. He blinked, his eyes adjusting to the soft lantern light. And then he saw the scene inside. Anna Steiner stood by the door, holding it open for him. She was wearing a simple wool dress with her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. She looked concerned, but not cold. Behind her, in the center of the room, her son Emil was sitting on the floor. He was barefoot, playing with a small wooden horse on the smooth plank floorboards. On the table, a loaf of bread was cooling on a rack, the faint scent of yeast and baked wheat hanging in the air. There was no frost on the inside of the single window pane. It was clear, showing only the blackness of the night outside. Jakob Steiner himself was sitting in a chair, not huddled over a fire, but leaning back comfortably, reading a book. He looked up, his expression calm. Vance stood there, speechless, a statue of ice and snow in the doorway of a summer afternoon. He was so stunned he forgot to close the door, letting the cold wind swirl in. "Mr. Vance," Jacob said, standing up. "Come in. You should not be out in this." Vance stumbled inside, pulling the door shut behind him. The sense of dislocation was overwhelming. He took off his gloves, his fingers numb and clumsy. The warmth in the room was not a dry, scorching heat like the one from his stove. It was a gentle, radiant warmth that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It felt like standing in the sun. His builder's mind, his skeptic's mind, took over. He started to investigate. He walked to the north wall, the wall that in his own cabin was bleeding cold. He pressed his bare palm against the logs. They were not cold. They were not even neutral. They were faintly, unbelievably warm. His gaze fell upon the source, Steiner's mud heap. It stood silent and massive in the heart of the room. There was no fire visible. The iron door of the firebox was closed and cool to the touch. He reached out a tentative hand and placed it on the clay flank of the structure. It was radiating heat, a deep, steady, powerful flow of warmth that was the source of the room's comfort. It was not hot enough to burn, but it was warmer than a living thing. It was a sleeping giant, breathing warmth into the space. "The fire," Vance stammered, his voice hoarse. "Your fire is out." "Yes," Jacob said simply. "I banked the coals from the morning fire. We will add more wood before bed." This was the moment the numbers began to dismantle Elias Vance's entire understanding of the world. The morning fire. It was now well past 8 o'clock at night. He thought of his own stove, which had consumed nearly a dozen logs since noon just to keep his family from freezing. He looked around the room and saw the wood box next to the mud heap. It was nearly full. There was perhaps a quarter of a cord stacked neatly against the wall. In his own home, they had already brought in twice that amount from the outside pile, and it was disappearing like sand through a sieve. He saw a small thermometer hanging on a wall away from the heater. He walked over to it. The mercury stood at 68 degrees. 68 degrees. He felt another wave of dizziness. His own cabin, with a fire roaring hot enough to warp the stove lid, was struggling to stay above 40. This was impossible. The numbers were undeniable. He turned back to Jakob, the full weight of his foolishness, his arrogance, crashing down on him. He had not just been wrong, he had been spectacularly, dangerously, publicly wrong. He had mocked a man who was living in a warm, safe home, while his own family shivered in a cabin built with all the celebrated wisdom of the frontier. He had laughed at a genius. He looked at Anna, at the barefoot child on the floor, at the calm, quiet man reading his book. He saw not foolishness, but a deep, profound wisdom. "Steiner," Elias Vance said, and his voice was thick with emotion. He had to clear his throat. "Jakob, I was wrong." The words came out with difficulty, but with absolute sincerity. "I was completely wrong. This is a miracle." He gestured around the warm, comfortable room. "You must teach me. You must show me how this works." In that moment, the carpenter from Ohio, the respected expert of Red Creek Bend, became the first student of the quiet immigrant from the Alps. The vindication was complete. It was not loud or boastful. It was as quiet and as powerful as the heat radiating from the mud walls of the heater itself. When the great cold snap finally broke a day later, the news of what Elias Vance had seen spread through the settlement faster than a prairie fire. It began as a rumor, a story too incredible to be believed. A warm cabin, a full wood box, barefoot children in the middle of the blue cold. It sounded like a fever dream, but the source of the story was unimpeachable. Elias Vance was not a man given to exaggeration. When he told the men at the trading post what he had witnessed, he did so with the humility of a convert. He described the radiant warmth, the untouched woodpile, the impossible temperature. He used the name he himself had coined for mockery, but now it was filled with awe. "Steiner's mud heap," he said, "it saved them, and it can save us." The transformation in the community was immediate and absolute. The mockery vanished, replaced by a deep and urgent curiosity. That spring, a procession of settlers came to Jakob Steiner's door. They did not come to scoff, they came to learn. Jakob, true to his nature, shared his knowledge freely. He showed them the principles of the insulated firebox, the importance of the long, winding flue. He explained the concept of thermal mass, of storing heat in stone and clay. He never once mentioned the ridicule he had endured. His vindication was not in their apology, but in their willingness to learn. Elias Vance became his most devoted apprentice and his greatest champion. With his carpentry skills and Jakob's masonry knowledge, they developed a standardized design that could be adapted to different cabin sizes. Vance, the former skeptic, was now the system's most passionate advocate, lending his considerable reputation to the strange, new idea. That summer, the sounds of construction in Red Creek Bend were different. Alongside the familiar sawing of logs, there was the squelch of mud being mixed, the clink of river stones being laid. In cabin after cabin, a Steiner heater, as they were now universally called, began to take shape. The folly had become the new standard. The following winter was just as cold, but the life of the settlement was transformed. The frantic daily struggle for firewood was gone. The constant gnawing cold inside the cabins was replaced by a steady, reliable warmth. Homes were no longer prisons of huddled misery. Families could use their entire living space. The health of the community improved. Fewer children suffered from coughs and lung ailments. The real impact was not measured in degrees on a thermometer or in cords of wood saved. It was measured in human dignity. It was the simple freedom of a woman being able to do her chores without wearing 3 layers of wool indoors. It was the quiet joy of a family eating dinner at a table, rather than crowded around a scorching stove. It was in the survival of the youngest and most vulnerable, who in previous winters might have been lost. Jakob Steiner's old-world knowledge had given the people of Red Creek Bend not just warmth, but a better, more secure life. The story of Jakob Steiner and his mud heater is a powerful lesson. It speaks to the conflict between entrenched tradition and disruptive innovation. It highlights the danger of dismissing an idea simply because it is unfamiliar, and the courage required to trust empirical evidence over popular opinion. The settlers of Red Creek Bend believed they knew everything about surviving the cold, but their knowledge was incomplete. They focused only on generating heat, while Jakob Steiner understood that the real secret was in preserving it. This principle of thermal mass is not some forgotten primitive technique. It is a cornerstone of modern, energy-efficient building design. Passive solar homes, masonry heaters, and radiant floor heating all operate on the same fundamental concept that Jakob demonstrated in his humble cabin. Absorb energy slowly, store it in a dense material, and release it gently over time. The mud heap was simply a frontier application of a timeless and elegant engineering principle. The story reminds us that sometimes the most profound solutions come from quiet outsiders, from those who carry a different perspective forged in a different world. It is a testament to the power of observation, persistence, and the simple, undeniable truth of what works. If this story made you think differently about the wisdom hidden in our past, hit that like button to share it with others. And subscribe for more tales of forgotten engineering and frontier ingenuity. We love to hear from our viewers, so drop a comment below and tell us about the coldest winter you have ever experienced. The story you have just heard is a fictionalized account created for educational and entertainment purposes. While the engineering principles of masonry heaters and thermal mass are very real and have been used for centuries, the characters, specific events, and location of Red Creek Bend are products of imagination. This narrative is intended to illustrate historical concepts and should not be taken as a guide for construction or professional advice. Always consult with qualified experts for any building project.